And my name is Eric Contreras. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Abe for the possibility of allowing ADAAG Consulting Service, our firm, to work with the Pensacola Area Housing Commission in this project. We are grateful for this opportunity, and we definitely think this project will have fruits in the end, and we will meet our goal of providing accessibility within the housing service. Right now, I would like to tell you that the speaker on your end is actually muted, because right now, otherwise we could start getting feedback and interruptions. So I will be doing most of the talking. However, any time that you would like to make a question or something like that, there is a tab bar where you can actually like text in your questions. So please feel free to send in any questions you have, or otherwise we will have a space towards the end of the presentation where we can go ahead and address all of these questions. Currently, as we said, so let's get started. And basically, the name of this presentation is Section 504, UFAS, FHA, and ADA for public housing authorities. What we are trying to do with this is basically the goal of this will be to review the federal requirements for public housing and measures to comply with the requirements. Where I left off, I was actually giving a little bit of the background on this. So our firm, ADAAG Consulting Services, was retained by the Pensacola Area Housing Commission to perform the accessibility transition plan. And a little bit of story on our firm. Our firm provides accessibility consulting services to both private companies as well as public entities throughout the country. We provide accessibility consulting, architecture, engineering, but our area of expertise is accessibility consulting, and primarily with public housing authorities. We do focus on their needs and services, as well as for like Department of Transportation. We help them in assisting their developing their transition plan for public rights of way, as well as for other school boards and educational facilities. Right now, we have either completed or we have ongoing contracts with North Carolina, in Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and California, to name others. So definitely, it's something that we have found that is in need basically throughout the country, and that is the area where we have specialized right now. Okay, so now starting with our presentation, as I mentioned, it's going to be a quick review of the federal requirements for the public housing, and how to comply with these measures, and the best practices that we can implement in achieving these measures. So we're going to start by going over the background. This is not something new. This has been out for quite a couple of years, and there's different laws and regulations to apply into all this. And as we will see, what happens is also there's like some type of level of cross coverage where one can overlap with the other, but basically all these elements will come into play. So we will go over some in more detail than others. The ones that are more applicable, I feel we will go into a little bit more depth, while others we're just going to go over, briefly, just because they will probably not be as applicable, if you will, to the Pensacola Area Housing Commission. The main ones that we're looking at, well, the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. Then there was also Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This established the UFAS, the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. Their operative date was roughly around 1988. The Fair Housing Accessibility Act. The Fair Housing Act basically had a date of, I believe it was March 15th, 1991. And the ADA, which basically there was the first ADA out back in 1992, and just recently the 2010 ADA that has just become enforceable as of March 15th, 2012. And being that we are in Florida, we also have the Florida Building Code that also became effective. The new code has become effective as of March 15, 2012. So we're going to go a little bit into these and just kind of explain the specific requirements that it entails for public housing authorities. Starting with Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act. This, well, was conceived in its inception, and basically it applies to public entities receiving federal funds, and in this case, multifamily housing was substantially altered after July 1988. So we can see that this one is clearly where has a clear direct impact on the Pensacola Area Housing Commission and many housing authorities throughout the country. And this is one of the main mandating regulations that HUD, enforces upon basically on the housing authorities. Now, in a nutshell, basically what this does is that it prohibits discrimination and different, basically on disability, sex, and marital status, a whole bunch of different categories. But in a nutshell, basically what this is to prohibit discrimination and like I said, on basis of disability. It also establishes certain requirements, if you will, to provide reasonable accommodation for qualified applicants. So basically, in some events, the governments might not have to make all of the facilities accessible, but they do have to provide a certain basic level of accommodation to persons that have disabilities and so forth. Also establishes requirements for new construction, whereas new construction has to be fully compliant, and alterations that have to try to meet the new construction requirements, but to the maximum extent feasible, as well as for public housing. And this one clearly establishes, which is what is most important for us at this point, is that it sets the UFAS as the standard as for what is accessible. So what we will see is that there are different entities and standard setting agencies such as HUD. HUD has basically been following the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards throughout all this period, and to this point is doing that. Even now that the 2010 ADA has been issued, they have not adopted these codes as of yet. They have not issued any statements. So we will see that there are certain differences between the UFAS standards and the ADA standards. But more importantly is that the UFAS standards, they have specific requirements for accessible dwelling units, and that is something that is not contained in DA, as we will see. So this one obviously will give us most of our guidance, and this is probably where we are going to focus on. Also, under Section 504, it establishes specific requirements for transition plan. Basically, a transition plan, what it is that because a lot of these programs have been in place for many years, at one point or another, they have to be evaluated. So the premise or the intent is to basically do a self-evaluation of these programs, review them, basically policies, procedures, and physical accessibilities, physical access, and identify deficiencies in these programs and services, identify methods to correct the deficiencies, establish a schedule to mitigate these deficiencies, and ultimately also establish the person that will be responsible for mitigating these deficiencies. Another important part that is set forth under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is the specific requirements for the public housing authorities under these under their housing programs to provide a minimum of accessible dwelling units. And it differentiates in two types. Number one, units that are designed for persons with mobility impairments, and it requires a minimum of 5%, and also units that are designed for persons with hearing and vision impairments, and for that it sets a minimum of 2%. Now, something that we must keep in mind is that these are, let's say, minimum thresholds that must be met. So what this means is that there is not a problem if we can exceed these, but we certainly do not want to be below this. Basically, the federal standards will always set these minimum thresholds, not a ceiling, not a cap, but a minimum that has to be met. So based on that is where we start with the requirements for establishing how many accessible units must be provided at the sites. Okay, as we mentioned, Section 504 determines that what is accessible is construction that is designed and built in compliance with the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. So Under the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, there are two types of requirements. There are specific scoping requirements, which a scoping requirement will tell us how many and what areas the requirements are applicable to, and then another type, which is technical requirements. Technical requirements will tell us what elements that were determined by the scoping, what they have to comply with. So for example, under the accessible site and exterior facilities, the scoping will tell us the amount of parking spaces that are required to comply with the guidelines. And the technical requirements will tell us the specific requirements that this parking space has to comply with. For example, a 2% slope in every direction, the dimensions of the parking space, and if it must have a signage and so forth. So that's kind of how the guidelines are structured. And there are specific components. Well, it's all pretty much applicable to the housing programs that housing authorities have, and we'll see that I have listed some of the ones that will be, that we were going to go through, which is, accessible site and exterior facilities, basically the requirement of providing accessible routes throughout the facility and the parking spaces, space allowances, reach ranges, accessible routes, ramps, curb ramps, stairs, elevators, doors, drinking fountains, signage, and common use restrooms. We're going to start going into this part to the technical requirements that the UFAS sets forth. And the reason of this is because there are some of these elements that are like building blocks, if you will. Think of them as Legos. Once we understand the general concept behind these elements, these will be applicable throughout the developments. And towards the end of our presentation, we will see specific examples and pictures depicting how these specific requirements apply and how, in the best practice, basically how we can implement when we do modifications to the premises. And also we must understand that currently the Pensacola Area Housing Commission is undergoing a process of updating and making the units, basically making modifications to units to make them comply with accessibility. So that is the first step in this whole process. Now, after this, there will be an ongoing obligation basically to maintain these accessible features and, the upkeep, as we will see, based on these requirements. So the first one is the clear floor space. And think of this as if one of us is standing up, this would be like the equivalent for somebody, and a lot of these will go to what a wheelchair is. The specific requirements of space for somebody seated in a wheelchair. So the minimum requirement for that is actually 30 inches wide by 48 inches long. And that is what is called a clear floor space. So basically, whenever we think of any element that is within one of these dwelling units or in an office or along any of the paths, we must think that somebody must have access to this element, either it be the mailbox, either if it is a vending machine or counter, but somebody has to have this 30 by 48 inch clear floor space in front of that element to be able to access it. So that is just when they're standing. But what happens when they are moving? When they are moving, that clear floor space is widened, if you will, and basically from it being a minimum to pass through a point of 32 inches, it has to be 36 inches continuous. So what we must think of at this point is basically providing an accessible route to each one of these elements. I'd like to think of it as the yellow brick road, a path that as a person, anybody can go from point A to point B, think of it from going from the public sidewalk, from the bus stop into the leasing office, into the accessible dwelling unit, going to the parking space, going to the different amenities, maybe a playground or an office, and all the way to basically the interior of the unit, to every single one of the rooms, to the living room, to the bathroom, the kitchen, dining, and any exterior areas that there might be, maybe a porch or a clothes drying line that's outside. So the concept is basically providing a minimum level of accessibility from point A to point B, where somebody can navigate throughout the entire site and throughout the units. Now, in addition to the clear space for a stationary person seated on a wheelchair and that continuous path throughout the site, also there is another requirement that, just like any of us can just basically turn around at one point and start heading back, and we're not going to walk backwards, but we're just going to turn around and face the opposite way. The same is applicable to a person on a wheelchair. So a minimum standard has been set for this, and it's called the turning space. So that turning space is considered a 60-inch diameter, where that's the minimum where somebody can approach in a wheelchair, make a U-turn, and head back forth from the way they were coming from. And that's depicted in the diagram that's on the left side with those two arrows. Somebody headed in one direction, let's say down, and they turn around and then they head back up north. So basically that's the concept of the turning space. And we will see that in general, the UFAS requirement establishes that where there are accessible spaces and elements, we must have this level of turning space, whereas somebody can actually approach, enter, and exit. So that will be the concept that we will see predominantly like in bathrooms and in the kitchens. Now, there is an alternative for this turning space, and it is called the T-shape, and that is the diagram that is on the right side. Now, the T-shape basically is a method of making basically a turnaround, which is, you know, kind of like if you were going in a car and you were to try to make a three-point entrance. And so what this does allow is that you approach from one side of the T, and from, let's say, from the center, you could go to either the left or the right, back up, and then turn around and head the other way. So when this is placed on if we were to see this from the top, this resembles a T-shape, and what the overall size of it is basically 60 by 60, but we can say that when you are in tight spaces such as restrooms, some people opt to provide the shape like this because it allows having different fixtures there, maybe like a water closet or a lavatory, and allows the person to just, you know, in that confined space be able to turn around without having to go to that 60-inch diameter turnaround space that we were mentioning. So we will see these elements, these building blocks, if you will, repeated throughout the specific requirements. Now, this is another very important one, and this is called the reach range. And basically, this is the concept or the idea behind this. Think of it, if we are standing up, we are allowed to raise our hand, and we can, you know, go ahead and grab any element that's at any you know, different height, but certainly, you know, we can reach any area 6 feet or something like that, just to put a number. So now, if we think of this in terms of somebody that is seated on a wheelchair, their reach ranges are reduced. And there's a different requirement for side reach and for forward reach. The concept being that if somebody is trying to grab an object in front of them, a forward reach, the one that is located on the left side, their reach ranges are basically between 15 to 48 inches. Whereas on the side reach, somebody has a lot more access to move their hand, and they can reach for elements between 9 to 54 inches. Now, on purpose, I basically just included the forward reach, which is a little bit more limited. As I mentioned in the past, HUD has not adopted the new ADA, but the new ADA, it is going to a different requirement. It is reducing the requirement to 48 inches. So trying to keep in line with that, we strongly suggest that most of the elements that are located, that are, well, or altered or placed now, should follow this guidance and try to locate them at 48 inches. And we will see that this also will be repeated in the Fair Housing Act requirements. So it is a good practice, or the best practice, if you will, to locate these elements that have to be accessible up to 48 inches above the finished floor. And this applies to all accessible elements. You know, we can think of coat hooks, shelves, storage, accessories, dispensers, you know, paper towel dispensers, soap dispensers, and all these type of features, that they should be located within these reach ranges, ideally the 48 inches maximum. Okay. Another interesting element that is called for in the requirements is for protruding objects. And basically what this idea is that, as we can see in the diagram on the left side, a person that has low vision or vision impairments might use a cane to navigate throughout a space. And there are different techniques. One is the cane sweeping technique. Another one is, you know, kind of utilizing walls to navigate going next to these walls. So what happens is that when there are elements that are mounted between 27 inches above the floor to 80 inches above the floor, these elements should not protrude more than 4 inches from the wall. Otherwise, they can become a protruding element where somebody can just bump into them and possibly hurt themselves. So what the goal will be that whenever there are elements throughout the